Good morning. We will start in a few minutes. Okay, what we have today is we will be revising the following sections. We will start with section 17 and go till section 19. That will be what we'll try to cover that today. And since yesterday's session, I would like to inform that some of you, after listening to us, had moved on to the website to download the BAR Act, and that's the older version. If you had access to a BAR Act version of the BAR Act without signing into your LexCampus account, then that is a old version of the act, and you will know that once you open the document, you will see that. But there is a new version which we had released, which you would get if you are a subscriber. So once you are a subscriber and you get in, you'll get the full version of the act. So please check it out. If you have downloaded the act from the outside, where it is accessible to everyone, probably you have downloaded the older version. We will soon be notifying so that you understand that this is something which this is something which you need to look at. We will guide you to where the act is, so you will be able to find that. Okay, we start with dating of application. Now this comes under the chapter powers of the controller. The controller has quite a lot of powers. We have already gone through the powers under section 16, which is to divide an application. It can be done voluntarily, or it could be done based on an objection raised by the controller. Now section 17 gives the power to the controller to date an application. Now dating, we have seen this before in the context of section 9 and again in the context of section 11, that dating can be of two types. You could either post date an application. Post date is nothing but giving up your earlier priority and post dating an application, choosing a date that is in the future, not the date which was initially assigned to the application, or not the initial priority date. Now post dating has a problem. The problem is if there is an intervening prior art between the original date and the newly posted date, which is the post dated date, then you would have a problem of the invention being invalidated because of an intervening prior art. So post dating is risky business without doubt, and it is done only in very rare instances because nobody wants to give up on priority unless there is a very strong reason, and the reason has to be analyzed, and they need to know what is the risk of post dating, and only in such cases an application is post dated. An application is post dated. Normally applications are not post dated, so this post dating is an exception. You have to bear that in mind. So when we talk about post dating, we are referring to giving up the earlier priority which was there and moving to a new priority. So the risk is, because you're moving into the future, there could be an intervening prior art which could kill the novelty of your invention. So this is one thing. So that is on post dating. On anti dating, it's the reverse. Anti dating is a later application, say a divisional application, or a child that comes from a parent, which is again a divisional. In anti dating, the latter application gets the priority from the former application. So you would say that because this is a divisional application, though it has a separate application number and it is now going to have its life as a separate application, still the priority comes from the earlier disclosure, what we call the parent. So the child gets the date of the parent. So this is anti-dating. The application is filed later in time, but it goes back to the date it goes back to an earlier date. Now let's go ahead with. Hold on. Okay, let's go ahead with our with today's session, dating of application, powers of controller, section 17. The first thing you need to remember when it comes to dating of application is the timing when the dating can be done. Now, section 17 very clearly mentions that the timing is before the grant. Now, we get this from the section where it is mentioned that subject to the provisions of section 9, any time after the filing of an application, any time after the filing of an application and before the grant of a patent. Under the Act, the controller may, at the request of an applicant made in the prescribed manner, direct the application to be post-dated to such a date as may be specified in the request and proceed with the application accordingly. Now, what we see here is that the timing of dating of the application, and in this case post dating, can or should happen before the grant, because once the patent is granted, you cannot change the priority date. It is fixed. So this is the first thing that you will remember is the timing, and the application can be post dated any time before the grant of a patent. Now, the second thing to remember is there is a limit for post dating. You cannot post date an application beyond the statutory limit. Now, we get that from section 17(1), that provided that no application shall be post dated under this subsection to a date later than 6 months. So 6 months is the time period for post dating, and it should not be posted beyond that. Now, we had already mentioned that section 9 and section 11(7) are the other two provisions that are relevant for this section. Now our BAR Act, and you can have access to the BAR Act on the LexCampus website. Once you sign in, you will get access to it. The provisions have the cross references, which you will not find in a normal BAR Act. Now you can see here section 9 and section 11(7) are the relevant provisions. So you could check those sections and understand what are the implications or how these two sections are relevant for section 17. So the second thing is the limit. There is a limit of 6 months. The third thing is that amendments, when in the case of section 15, and section 15 you will recollect that the controller has the power to request the applicant to make certain amendments. Now, when those amendments can either be done in compliance of the objection raised, or in presenting, or when the amendments are done, the date will be the refiling date. So it could be in case of amendments under section 15, if there is a compliance that needs to be done, the date will be the day on which the compliance was completed. Or if there was a refiling that required to be done, like the controller asked the applicant to refile a document, correct it and refile it, then it will be the date on which the refiling was done. So in the case of amendments, the date can change to the compliance date or the refiling date. Now we get this in 17(2), where it is mentioned, and the cross-referred section is section 15. That when other documents are required to be amended under section 15, the application or specification or other document, any of the documents, if the controller so directs, be deemed to have been made on the date on which the requirement is complied. So this is what we call the compliance date. The date on which it is complied becomes the date of the application, or the date on which it is refiled. Sometimes the controller returns the document, and the applicant has to make certain changes in the document and represent it before the controller. So the date can change. Again, this is another case of post dating. You initially filed a document. The document was not in compliance with the requirements of the law. The controller raised those objections, and you complied with those objections. So the date changes from the date on which you filed to the date on which you complied. This is one thing. Again, an instance of post dating. The other instance of post dating is where the controller returned a document that you filed and you made corrections to the document and you filed it back, or what the act says, the date on which it was refiled. Again, the date on which you originally filed is going to be different from the date on which you refile the application. So again, this is another case of post dating. So you will now understand under section 17 there are two types of post dating. One is a post dating which you can do within a statutory limit, which is 6 months. And the risk of post dating is that if there is an intervening prior art between that period of your original application and the date of post dating, which is within 6 months, then it will be hit by a novelty issue or a inventive step issue. If there is an intervening prior art, these are the two things that can get affected. Your novelty can get affected, your inventive step requirement can get affected. So that is the post dating under 17.1. In 17.2, we have a different type of post dating. Post dating in the sense that this is completely under the ambit of section 15, and in section 15 you know that when the controller can raise many objections and ask you to comply with many things, and this is entire prosecution happens under section 15. So if the controller raises an objection to say that you have not complied with something, then the date of the application is no longer the date on which the application was filed. It becomes the date on which the requirement was complied. Now, it could be a compliance requirement or it could be a refiling requirement. A document was not in order and it was asked to be refiled. So the applicant refiles the document. Again, the date changes. It changes from the date on which it was originally filed to the date on which it was refiled. Again, so this is the second type of post dating. So 17.2 17.2 presents a different type of post dating with regard to 17.1. So these are the 3 points to be remembered under section 17. Anticipation, powers of the controller, section 18. The first thing to remember when it comes to anticipation under section 18 is that the controller has the power to refuse the application if it is hit by anticipation. Now we get this from section 18, and you can see in the Bar Act we give all the relevant references. Section 13.1a is relevant here. Section 13 Section 13.2 is relevant here. Rule 28 and Rule 30 are relevant. So this is in one place you are going to get everything that is relevant for your preparation. Now here, when it appears to the controller that the invention in a complete specification has been anticipated. Now this anticipation comes under subsection 1 and 2 of section 13. Now if this happens, and we have already covered the subsection 1 and 2 of section 13, you can go back to those lessons. Now if this happens, if there is anticipation with regard to under the ambit of section 13, the controller has the power to refuse the application. Now this is already covered. We know that under section 13, if there is anticipation to tell you what anticipation again is, the priority date of an application starts on a particular date. If the subject matter of the application is covered in a document of an earlier priority, which was published, it amounts to anticipation. Now anticipation, there are definitions of anticipation, there are sections on anticipation, there are grounds on which a patent can be revoked on anticipation. So this just reiterates the power under section 13, which you have already seen. It just reiterates the power under section 13 that in case of anticipation, the controller can refuse the application. Now, there are two things here to remember. Now, this is what the controller can do. Now, you may ask a question because eventually you are going to become patent agents. You may ask what should be the response of a patent agent if the controller raises an issue of anticipation. Now, the Act here, 18.1, gives two responses that a patent agent or an applicant can do. The first response is that what we call defenses. There are two defenses that an applicant can take. One is to say that this is not a case of anticipation. This is not a case of anticipation because my application has an earlier priority. So the first defense is to demonstrate to the controller, to satisfy the controller that your priority is earlier. Obviously, then the prior art, whichever the controller has cited, does not affect you. The second response is that you can amend the application so as to remove what has already been anticipated from your application to the extent it is possible. So sometimes, as a best practice, patent agents use both. They not only argue, try to satisfy the controller, they also have an amendment in place just in case the controller is not satisfied. They can amend and get a patent granted. Now, again, 18.1, if you see, these are the two things that you can do in response to an objection raised by the controller that there is a section 13 objection on anticipation. The applicant can show to the satisfaction of the controller that the priority date of the claim was not later than the date of the relevant document. Not later as in it was either at the same time or before. So if it's at the same time or before, it cannot be anticipated. Then the second response is that amends is complete specification to the satisfaction of the controller. So these are the two things you can. The defense number one is to satisfy the controller. Satisfaction of the controller is the word the act uses. Satisfy the controller. This is largely by argument. You go for a hearing and you try to show the controller that your priority is earlier than the document with the controller has cited. Or the second defense that you will have against anticipation is an amend your application so as to get over the issue with regard to anticipation, which is largely you remove the overlapping part and you change the scope of your invention. That's how you do it. Now, you could have a question. You could have a question in the exam on anticipation based on this provision. The question could be, what are the two responses an applicant can make in reply to a case of anticipation or an objection of anticipation raised by the controller. And you could, in the patent agent exam, you could have choices, which more than one choices which are correct. So if they give you this as a choice, argue with the controller stating that the priority date is earlier, which is correct, or amend the specification to the satisfaction of the controller, which is also correct. So you should know that the defenses to anticipation under the Act, we have two defenses. One is to argue that you have an earlier priority or to amend the application. And as I already mentioned, as a best practice, patent agents do both. They argue, and to the extent, because it cannot be one or the other, because if the controller is not happy with your arguments and if the controller still feels that the document anticipates your invention, then you lose your application. So it's a best practice to do both, argue, and by way of abundant caution also amend your application. Now on 18, the controller can make a reference in case of an anticipation. Now we get that from 18.2, where it is mentioned that under clause B of subsection 1 of section 13, the controller has the power to make direct that a reference to the other specification. Now this can happen in few cases, and I'll tell you there's a difference between a reference made in anticipation and in the next section, that is section 19, a reference made in case of a potential infringement. Now, potential infringement is a clear-cut case where there is an infringement happening, or if the patent is going to be granted on the application, it would infringe an earlier application. That's a clear-cut case. Here, there is anticipation, and in the controller's viewpoint, there is anticipation. So what the controller can do, rather than refusing the application, which he has the power to do, which we just saw, the controller has the power to refuse under section 13. In this case, when it is under section 13(1)(b), the controller has a power to make a reference to the other specification. So how this is done is, inside the application, inside the specification, there is a reference made shall be inserted by way of notice to the public in the applicant's complete specification. Now this is done by the controller. So the reference is to the earlier application, saying that this invention or this aspect of the invention is covered by application number so and so. So this reference can be done by the controller. The controller can give a reference to the other specification. Now again, this is different from refusing the application. So you need to understand there will be certain cases where it may not be a strong case to reject the entire invention. Maybe only one element of the invention was anticipated. So rather than the controller refusing the entire application because only there was an element of the invention that was overlapping, the controller may introduce a reference to that other specification. Now, this is what we call a reference made by the controller to another specification in case of anticipation. Now, what can be the defense in that case? In that case, again, the defense comes down to the two things that we already mentioned in case of a normal anticipation under Section 13. You could argue that your priority is earlier, or you could amend the application. And you have those two options here. The applicant shows to the satisfaction of the controller that the priority date of his claim is not later than the priority date, which is either on at the same time or before, or the complete specification is amended. So again, for anticipation under 18, which entitles the controller to have a reference as opposed to refusing the application, and there's a difference between making a reference in the complete specification and refusing the application altogether, then the response is again the same. You could either argue saying that yours is earlier, you have an earlier priority, or you can amend. Now, there is another type of anticipation. Now we saw an anticipation under Section 13. We saw an anticipation where, again under Section 13, but an anticipation where the controller can make a reference. Now there is also an anticipation which results from an investigation. An investigation, you know that Section 13, an examiner can make an investigation on how the on Section 13, on the provisions of Section 13. An investigation can be made, and an investigation report is filed by the examiner to the controller. Now we know that this is the power that is under Section 13. Now, once there is a result of an investigation, and there is anticipation post investigation, that we say that after the investigation under Section 13 or otherwise. So there is under Section 13, you will see that there could be an anticipation under Section 13, and there could be anticipation in other cases as well. Then the invention that has been claimed in the complete specification has been claimed before. So that's anticipation under Section 13(1)(a). It has already been claimed before in a complete specification, or in a complete specification published on or after the priority date of the applicant's claim. So this is under Section 13(1)(a), or such other complete specification which is published after the priority date of the applicant's claim. Now, again, in these two cases, you will see that after the priority date, the defenses, you will see that again to the satisfaction of the controller, you can demonstrate that you had earlier priority, and the applicant's claim is not later than the priority of the other document, or you can show that you have the provisions of subsection 2 will apply, which is what we saw, that in the same manner you can amend, or you can argue or amend. You can claim that you have priority. So it refers you back to the subsection 2, which is the same two defenses that were open for in the case where a reference was made in case of anticipation. Again, so we have in Section 18, we have three types of anticipation, or three powers that are, let's say not three types of application anticipation, let's say three powers the controller has to do things in case of anticipation. The first power is that the controller can refuse. The second, the controller can make a reference. The third, when there is an investigation done, again based on the documents, the controller can refuse the application, but again you have the power to, as an applicant, you have the power to satisfy the controller that saying that the defense, raise the defense that your priority is earlier, or you can amend the application. Potential infringement, powers of controller. Now under section 19, one of the power that the controller has is to make a reference in case of a potential infringement. Now we get it in section 19, and you can see the relevant provisions on the margin, rule 29, 32 and 33. These are the rules that are relevant, and if you see our main video on this, the lesson on section 19, you will find explanation to everything in one place. So please make it, this is because this is just a revision, we will not be covering this in great detail here. Rule 29, 32 and 33 are the relevant rules for this provision. Now in the consequence of an investigation, if the controller comes to the conclusion that the application for a patent cannot be performed. Now this comes down to working of the invention, or what we call enablement. When you work the invention, one of the requirements in section 64 is that you have to disclose, you have to make an enabling disclosure with regard to how the invention is performed or how the invention works. There is also a requirement that you have to disclose the best method of working. So all these things comes down to how the invention will actually work in practice. So this is a requirement. So we cannot grant a patent for something that is in the abstract and that doesn't work. So how the invention performs is a requirement under the Patents Act. You can get a patent rejected or revoked if the invention does not work. Now, if while working the invention, if the controller finds that it cannot be performed without substantial risk of infringement, without substantial risk of infringement of a claim of any other patent, then he may direct a reference to that other patent. Now, this is slightly different from what you saw before. We are not talking about anticipation. We are talking about infringement. So that's why normally you will know that under the scheme of the Act, infringement is something that the court alone can decide. A case for infringement can only be filed before the High Court, and infringement suits are decided by the High Court. It is not within the power of the Patent Office and within the power of the controller to decide infringement. It is not. I mean, infringement suits come before the District Court or the High Court, and you have provision 104 onwards. They all cover infringement. What you have here is potential infringement. You need to understand this. Now, potential infringement is in the opinion of the controller. The controller feels that there could be a substantial risk, not actual, substantial risk of infringement. Then again, the controller does not refuse the application. You need to understand this. There's no refusal of application. The controller will make a reference to that other patent and grant it. Why will the controller grant it? Because it is the job of the court to determine infringement. So potential infringement is different from a decision on infringement that a High Court may give. And the reason for that is that you will find that potential infringement is not is not similar to what happens in an infringement suit. Because in an infringement suit, there is a defendant whose product has infringed the patent, and the court can look into both sides of the argument. The defendant may sometimes raise invalidity as a defense to invalidate the patent. So there's so much happening before the court. Whereas before the controller, the defendant is not there. The infringing party is not there. In fact, the applicant could become the defendant in the future. That's a scenario here. And there is no other party to provide information for the court. There are no experts. There are no scientific advisors. It's a different setup altogether. So because of that, because it's only between the controller and the applicant, the controller can now say, I see there is a risk of potential infringement for your invention. So if it is granted, there could be an infringement suit against you. So I am making a reference. So the controller directs that a reference to the other patent made. So the reference is made within the patent specification. Now, if this happens, what are the defenses? Again, the defenses are two, but the first defense is not arguing that you have earlier priority. The first defense is to show that the other patent could be invalid. There is a potential for the other patent to be invalid. If the other patent is invalid, there is no risk of infringement. Again, I had mentioned this. One of the defenses that the defendant can make in an infringement suit is to invalidate the patent. If you look at the language of section 64, all the grounds are grounds that you can take in an infringement suit to invalidate the patent which the plaintiff is trying to enforce against the defendant. Now, what are the two things that they can do? Show to the satisfaction of the controller that there are reasonable grounds for contesting the validity. It's not even to show the controller that the application is invalid, just to mention that there are reasonable grounds for contesting the validity. Why? Because the controller does not have the power to look into the validity of another patent. That's the power exclusively given to the High Court. The IPAB had the power, but now it's completely with the High Court. The validity of a patent can only be questioned today before the High Court. So because the controller cannot do it, all the applicant needs to show is that there are reasonable grounds for contesting the validity. The second thing which the controller can, which the applicant can do is to, amend to the satisfaction of the controller. Now, these are the two defenses that you can take in case of a potential infringement. And potential infringement is different from an infringement suit, which is in section 104 onwards. You can see the provisions that cover infringement suits. Now, there can be a deletion of reference. Now, we saw that in case of a potential infringement, what the controller would do is the controller will make a reference to the other application, which could the controller will make a reference to the other application which could potentially infringe. Now, there are three cases where an applicant can ask the reference to be deleted. So deletion of reference, the controller has already made a reference. Now the applicant can say that in three cases, the application can ask the reference to be deleted. Now, reference to another patent has been inserted. It's already there. Now, what are the three cases? The first case is the other patent is revoked or otherwise ceases to be enforced. Now, revoked because there was a challenge. This applicant could have challenged that in, say, in High Court or earlier before the IPAB, and the patent got revoked. So if it gets revoked, they can come back to the patent office and say, please remove the reference. Or it ceases to be enforced. Either it has died by lapse of time, or the patentee did not pay the renewal fee and it ceased. In either case, the applicant can come back and say, remove the reference because the patent has been revoked or it does not exist. That's case number one. Case number two, the other patent is amended by deletion of the relevant claim. There was a relevant claim which was overlapping, which was the subject matter of the potential infringement. The other patent got amended, maybe in a suit or maybe in some proceeding, post-grant proceeding, it got amended and that relevant claim was deleted. So that's the second case. That particular provision which amounted to potential infringement is no longer there in that patent. So you can ask for a deletion of the reference. The third case is in proceedings before the court or the controller. Controller, they are referring to post-grant proceedings here. The relevant claim of that other patent is invalid or is not infringed by any working of a applicant's invention. Now, the relevant patent is invalid. This patent became invalid before the controller. It can't be anything else. It has to be a post-grant proceeding. So because the patent became invalid in a court or is not infringed by working of the applicant's invention. Now, for this to understand the difference between invalidity and non-infringement, you have to understand section 104, 105 and 105. Okay, 105 talks about a declaratory suit. a declaration of non-infringement, and you have to check that provision. So you could file a declaration saying that what I'm doing is completely different from this patent, and get a declaration saying that you are not infringing. So if there is a declaration of non-infringement, that is what they are referring to here under section 105, then you could again go back to the controller and say that remove or delete the reference. So these are the three cases where you could delete the reference to that other patent. Yes, now that concludes today's session. So we will try to keep our sessions short, and we will try to see. Let me just check the chat. I mean, let's see what are the. I can see some messages here. Okay. Okay, I need to. I'm sorry, I'm not logged into the LexCampus account, so I'm not able to see the chat. Anyway, so we will now since we have completed section up till section 19. I would want you to go back and look at the revision from section 1 onwards, and please come up to speed till here. And we are trying to create some multiple choice questions on these, whatever we have covered in our revision. So and that will be made available to you on the LexCampus website. Now we will start off with section 20 and 21 soon, and we'll notify you. So please subscribe to our channel so that you get notified on the next sessions. Thank you for joining us.